Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the year 1832, the French quarter of New Orleans hummed with prosperity and commerce, its narrow streets echoing with the calls of merchants and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages over cobblestones, worn smooth by countless passages. Among the most respected establishments was Franklin's Trading House on Dauphine Street, owned by Theodore Franklin, a man of 42 years whose success in importing goods from Europe had earned him considerable wealth and social standing that extended beyond mere commercial achievement into the rarefied circles of Creole society. Theodore resided with his family in an elegant townhouse on Royal Street, a 3-story structure of pink stucco with wrought iron balconies that caught the morning light and cast intricate shadows that seemed to dance across the facade as the sun traversed the sky. His wife, Marguerite, a beauty of 38 years from an established Creole family, whose lineage could be traced to the original French settlers, was known for hosting refined soirees that drew the city's elite, events where political alliances were forged over champagne, and where the subtle hierarchies of New Orleans society were reinforced through carefully orchestrated social rituals. Their 3 children completed the portrait of domestic success. Adelaide, 16 and accomplished in music and languages, whose performances on the pianoforte were said to move even the most stoic listeners to tears. Charles, 14, and showing promise in his father's business with a quick mind for figures and an intuitive understanding of market fluctuations. And Josephine, 10 years old, with an unusual sensitivity that her mother attributed to artistic temperament, though others whispered of second sight. The Franklin townhouse stood out, even among its distinguished neighbors, for one particular feature: an ancient stone well in its central courtyard, far older than the house itself, its depths seemingly bottomless, and its water crystal clear, even in the hottest months when other wells ran brackish or dry. Neighbors would later recall how the family, despite their wealth and social position, maintained an unusual reclusiveness, declining invitations and limiting their public appearances to essential business and religious obligations, a peculiarity that seemed to intensify with each passing season. This peculiarity was attributed to Theodore's increasing preoccupation with what he termed private researches, though none could have imagined the true nature of his interests or the dark path upon which he was about to embark, transforming his family's comfortable existence into something that would haunt New Orleans for generations to come. The first indication of Theodore Franklin's descent into obsession appeared in the classified advertisements of the New Orleans Commercial Bulletin during the spring of 1832, carefully worded notices that would seem innocuous to casual readers, but contained specific language designed to attract a particular category of desperate men. The notices, placed weekly with clockwork regularity, sought hardy laborers for private excavation work, with unusual specifications that raised eyebrows among those who paid attention to such details. Workers must possess no family ties that might lead to inquiries about their whereabouts, maintain absolute discretion about the nature of their employment, and agree to temporary residence on the employer's property for the duration of their contract. The wages offered were remarkably generous, nearly double the standard rate for manual labor, a sum that attracted not the typical day laborers who congregated at the market squares, but a different breed entirely, drifters whose past caught up with them in dreams, recent immigrants who spoke little English or French, and those seeking to escape histories they could never quite outrun. Henry Gautier, a former soldier who had wandered south from Canada after deserting his regiment following incidents he refused to discuss, even in his cups, was among the first to respond to these advertisements. In a letter discovered decades later, hidden in the binding of a Bible at a boarding house where he had briefly stayed, Gautier described his initial meeting with Theodore Franklin as unsettling, noting the merchant's intense scrutiny that seemed to peer not just at a man's face but through to his very soul, and peculiar questions about his family connections, religious beliefs, and whether he had ever experienced visions or heard voices that others could not perceive. Other workers who gathered at the Franklin townhouse shared similar profiles of displacement and desperation. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a Haitian refugee who had fled the revolution with nothing but the clothes on his back and memories that made him wake screaming. Patrick O'Malley, an Irish immigrant fleeing both famine and a murder charge that may or may not have been justified. Lorenzo Calabria, an Italian sailor who had jumped ship in port after witnessing something during a storm off the African coast that had turned his black hair white in a single night. Each man was carefully selected after private interviews conducted in Theodore's study, where he would examine their hands for strength and calluses that spoke of hard labor, their eyes for what he termed the necessary constitution, a quality he never defined but seemed to recognize instantly, and their reactions to certain objects and symbols he would casually display during conversation. The true nature of Theodore Franklin's project became apparent only when work commenced in early April 1832, revealing not the construction or renovation that neighbors had assumed, but an inexplicable deepening of the ancient well that had stood in the courtyard since before the house was built, perhaps before the city itself was properly founded. Workers were instructed to descend into the well using a specially constructed wooden framework with platforms at various levels, an elaborate scaffolding system that seemed over-engineered for a simple excavation, but which Theodore had designed according to specifications found in ancient texts he consulted nightly. The men carefully removed stones and earth while preserving the original circular structure, work that proceeded with archaeological precision rather than the rough efficiency typical of well digging, as Theodore insisted that every stone be catalogued and every layer of soil examined for artifacts. Theodore supervised every aspect personally, consulting detailed architectural drawings that seemed to predate any known surveys of the area, and taking precise measurements with instruments more suited to navigation or astronomy than construction, including devices with no clear purpose that he had commissioned from craftsmen who asked no questions. The well's original depth was already considerable at 30 feet, reaching past the water table into layers of earth that should have been undisturbed since the Mississippi's course had stabilized. But Theodore's plans called for an excavation extending far beyond any practical purpose for water access, into depths where the very nature of the ground began to change. As the workers descended past the 50-foot mark, they encountered older stonework beneath the colonial-era construction, massive blocks fitted without mortar in a technique that predated European settlement and showed tooling marks unlike anything known to modern masonry. These discoveries excited Theodore tremendously. He would spend hours examining each uncovered stone with magnifying lenses and strange instruments, copying symbols and markings into a leather-bound journal he kept locked in his study, pages that were said to emit a faint phosphorescence in darkness. The work progressed slowly due to Theodore's insistence on preserving these ancient elements, requiring the careful removal of fill material that had accumulated over centuries, some of which contained artifacts that should not have existed in those strata, glass beads that preceded glass-making in the region, metal tools of unknown composition, and most disturbing, human teeth scattered throughout the fill, as if from multiple bodies deposited over time. Workers began reporting unsettling experiences almost immediately. Tools would be found moved from where they were left, sometimes arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate. Strange echoes would emanate from the depths that didn't match the sounds being made by men or machinery, and several workers complained of vivid nightmares featuring drowning in black water that had the consistency of oil despite being able to swim. Among the papers recovered from the Franklin estate after the horrifying culmination of events was a series of entries from Marguerite Franklin's private journal, written in her delicate script that grew increasingly erratic as the months progressed and hidden beneath the false bottom of her jewelry box, a hiding place that suggests she feared discovery by her own husband. These intimate recordings reveal a woman increasingly alarmed by her husband's transformation from a conventional, if ambitious merchant into someone she barely recognized. A stranger who wore her husband's face but whose eyes held depths she dared not contemplate. Her earliest entries from March 1832 describe Theodore's late-night activities, with the bewilderment of a wife trying to understand her husband's new passion. He rises at the third bell, that hour when they say the barrier between worlds grows thin, and descends to his study where candlelight flickers until dawn, casting shadows that seem to move independently of the flames that birth them. When I questioned him about these vigils, he spoke of calculations that could only be performed when the city sleeps and the vibrations of commerce cease, when the subtle emanations of the earth can be properly measured and recorded. She noted with growing concern his correspondence with unnamed parties in Europe, letters that arrived without postal markings as if delivered by private courier, and which he would burn after reading. The smoke from these burnings filling the house with an acrid smell that lingered in fabrics and hair. His acquisition of books disturbed her particularly, volumes in Latin, Greek, and languages she couldn't identify, dealing with subjects that seemed to her incompatible with Christian faith or natural philosophy. Theodore claims these texts concern ancient architecture and engineering, she wrote in an entry dated March 15th. But I have glimpsed illustrations that trouble my dreams, diagrams of spaces that hurt the eye to follow, as if the very paper rebels against containing such geometries, symbols that seem to writhe upon the page when viewed obliquely, and worst of all, detailed anatomical drawings of creatures that combine human and utterly inhuman elements in ways that speak of deliberate design rather than birth. Her observations grew more distressing as the excavation began, chronicling changes not just in Theodore's behavior, but in the very atmosphere of their home. He speaks now of preparing for what lies beneath, as if something awaits discovery rather than mere water and stone, as if the well is not being dug but rather uncovered, revealed, liberated. His excitement upon returning from the courtyard each evening resembles fever more than satisfaction, and his hands shake with a palsy that speaks not of exhaustion, but of contact with forces that human flesh was not meant to channel. When I asked why we must dig so deep, he grasped my shoulders with fingers that felt too cold, and spoke of obligations inherited through blood, of promises made by his forefathers that must be fulfilled, lest our entire lineage face consequences too terrible to name. The Franklin children, despite their parents' attempts at protection through maintaining a facade of normalcy, could not remain unaware of the strange transformation occurring within their household, and their innocent observations would prove to be some of the most disturbing evidence of the true nature of the horrors unfolding beneath their home. Adelaide, the eldest at 16, began keeping her own diary in April 1832, initially as an exercise in improving her penmanship, but soon as a desperate record of events she could neither understand nor escape, documenting observations that would prove crucial to later investigations into the Franklin family's fate. Her refined handwriting, trained by years of careful instruction from the best tutors New Orleans could provide, betrayed increasing distress as she described sounds emanating from below the house at night, a grinding like great millstones turning, yet our home has no such machinery, no practical reason for such noise. The sound seems to rise through the very foundations, strongest near the courtyard, where Papa's workers toil by lamplight, and it carries with it vibrations that make the crystals in the chandelier sing discordant notes that hurt to hear. She wrote with a sister's concern of finding her younger brother Charles at his desk in the pre-dawn hours. Creating disturbing drawings, he claimed, came to him in dreams that felt more real than waking life. These sketches, several of which survived pressed between the pages of her diary, depicted elongated figures emerging from circular openings that might have been wells or portals, their proportions wrong in ways that suggested they were not entirely human, possessing too many joints in their limbs and faces that seemed to shift expression when viewed from different angles. Most unsettling were young. Josephine's reports of whispers from the water, that she insisted called her name in languages she didn't understand but somehow comprehended. Voices that promised her wonderful things if only she would come closer, descend deeper, abandon the pretense of human form. Adelaide documented finding her youngest sister standing at her bedroom window overlooking the courtyard in the dead of night, conversing with empty air in a voice not quite her own, speaking words in languages that no 10-year-old should know, making promises that no child should understand. The children's governess, Marie Delacroix, a woman of impeccable reputation who had served several prominent families and was known for her firm but loving hand with difficult children, began expressing concerns about her charge's well-being that went beyond normal childhood maladies. Adelaide overheard heated discussions between Marie and their mother, with the governess insisting the children needed distance from whatever was occurring on the property, suggesting visits to relatives in the countryside or perhaps a therapeutic journey to the seaside where clean air and distance might cleanse whatever influence was taking hold. Marie's particular alarm centered on Josephine's increasingly frequent trances, during which the child's eyes would roll back and she would speak in multiple voices, and Charles's violent outbursts when prevented from approaching the well, reactions that included superhuman strength and knowledge of obscenities in dead languages. As spring turned to summer, and the original workers disappeared one by one, under circumstances that grew increasingly difficult to explain away, Theodore Franklin's recruitment efforts became increasingly desperate and specific, targeting individuals whose disappearance would raise no alarms, and whose inability to communicate would ensure their silence. The new laborers he sought were recent arrivals to New Orleans who spoke neither French nor English, making communication with locals impossible and ensuring that whatever they witnessed in the depths of the well would remain unspoken. Ships' manifests from the period, carefully preserved in the maritime archives, show Theodore haunting the docks like a specter, approaching confused immigrants with offers of employment communicated through gesture and sketch rather than words, his mere presence enough to convince desperate men to follow him. These men, Chinese sailors who had jumped ship rather than returned to famines and wars they could not survive, Eastern European refugees fleeing pogroms whose horrors pursued them across oceans, indigenous peoples from Central America sold into bondage and escaped, were housed separately from any remaining original workers and kept under strict supervision that resembled imprisonment more than employment. The well had by now reached a depth of over 100 feet, far exceeding any aquifer level, and requiring elaborate pulley systems to remove excavated material, mechanisms that groaned under loads that seemed heavier than mere earth and stone should be. Workers descended in shifts that grew ever shorter, spending no more than 2 hours in the depths before being hauled surfaceward, many emerging pale and shaking despite the cooler temperatures below, their eyes holding a glassy sheen that spoke of sights human minds struggled to process. The walls at these depths revealed more of the ancient stonework, now showing clear signs of artificial construction that predated any known civilization in the region, smooth-bore holes drilled with impossible precision that suggested tools beyond the metallurgy of any ancient culture, channels carved in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye, as if they existed in more dimensions than the human mind could perceive, and symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, assuming different meanings based on the mental state of the observer. Theodore's excitement grew with each discovery. Witnesses reported seeing him lower himself into the well for hours at a time, sustained by mechanisms that allowed him to remain at depths where the air itself should have been too thin to breathe. Emerging with rubbings and sketches, he would immediately lock away in containers that themselves bore protective sigils. New equipment arrived under cover of darkness, metal rods of unusual composition that sang when struck and continued vibrating long after they should have stilled. Measuring devices of unknown purpose that employed principles neither mechanical nor electrical, and crates marked with symbols rather than words that occasionally emitted sounds suggesting something within still lived. The disappearances among the workers accelerated from one every few weeks to several each night. Yet Theodore somehow maintained his workforce through constant recruitment and increasingly exorbitant payments. Gold coins that bore stamps no numismatist could identify, and that were said to grow warm to the touch during certain lunar phases. The moral and spiritual deterioration of the Franklin household found its most detailed and disturbing chronicler in Father Benedict Thibodeau of St. Louis Cathedral, whose private records survived hidden in the cathedral archives until their discovery in 1923 during renovations that revealed a hidden chamber containing documents the church had thought best forgotten. Father Thibodeau, a meticulous keeper of records whose precise handwriting reflected a mind that sought order in a world increasingly revealing its chaos, documented not only confessions, but also his observations of parishioners' spiritual states. And his entries regarding Theodore Franklin paint a portrait of a man sliding from eccentric scholarship into something that threatened not just his own soul, but the spiritual fabric of the entire community. The priest noted that Theodore's church attendance, once as regular as the bells that called the faithful to Mass, became erratic by May 1832, and when he did appear, he would sit apart from his family in the shadows of the back pews, lips moving in what appeared to be prayer, but in no language the priest recognized, neither Latin nor French, nor any tongue spoken by Christian mouths. During confession, which Theodore still attended though irregularly, he asked increasingly bizarre questions about pre-Christian rituals that had been practiced in the land before the cross arrived. Pressing the priest about Vatican archives he claimed must exist, and whether certain books had truly been destroyed in ancient purges or merely hidden in repositories beneath street Peters. Father Thibodeau recorded his growing alarm when Theodore began speaking of agreements made before the cross came to these lands, and obligations that supersede baptismal vows, suggesting a theology that placed certain bloodline commitments above the salvation offered by Christ, a heresy that went beyond simple apostasy into realms the priest struggled to name. The priest's investigation into the Franklin family history, conducted through correspondence with colleagues in France and examination of records that most would have overlooked, revealed troubling patterns spanning generations. Theodore's grandfather had also been associated with mysterious excavations, first in France, near sites of ancient Gallic worship, before emigrating to Louisiana, where he had sought out specific locations marked on maps that predated official surveys, and his father had died under circumstances the family refused to discuss, leaving behind papers that Theodore had inherited and studied with the devotion others reserved for scripture. Church records from rural parishes throughout Louisiana and Mississippi showed the Franklin line had been repeatedly censured for heterodox practices, including the performance of rituals that combined Christian elements with older traditions, yet had always maintained enough wealth and influence to avoid serious consequences, their donations to the church serving as a form of spiritual hush money. Father Thibodeau's final entries regarding Theodore describe a man who had moved beyond mere heresy into something the priest struggled to name, noting that Theodore's presence in the cathedral now caused devotional candles to flicker and die without wind, holy water to bubble and steam in its fonts, and, most disturbing, caused certain statues of saints to weep what appeared to be blood, but which, upon closer examination, proved to be a substance that defied analysis and evaporated moments after appearing. The night of the 15th of August, 1832, brought one of the most violent thunderstorms in New Orleans' recorded history. A tempest that seemed to arise from nowhere and focus its fury on the French Quarter with particular vehemence, with winds that shattered windows and tore shutters from their hinges and rain that turned streets into torrents, carrying away anything not firmly anchored. Yet, even amid this natural fury that had citizens cowering in their homes and praying for deliverance, multiple witnesses reported phenomena at the Franklin property that defied not only explanation, but the very laws that govern natural events. Jacques Dumont, whose townhouse adjoined the Franklins, and who had observed their strange activities with growing concern for months, swore in a sworn affidavit given before 3 separate judges that he observed beams of sickly yellow light shooting upward from the Franklin courtyard, visible even through the driving rain that should have obscured any illumination, and seeming to pulse in rhythm with the lightning strikes, as if drawing power from the storm itself. Other neighbors, huddled in their homes and peering through windows despite their terror, reported that the sound of digging continued throughout the storm, an impossibility given that such work would have been suicidal in those conditions, and that voices could be heard chanting in unison, though the words were indistinguishable above the thunder, a sound that seemed to come not from human throats, but from the very earth itself. Marie Delacroix, the children's governess, who had watched with growing horror as her charges were drawn into their father's madness, chose this night to attempt her desperate escape with the 3 Franklin children, having become convinced through signs both subtle and overt that their lives were in mortal and spiritual danger that went beyond mere physical threat. Adelaide later recounted in a deposition given to church authorities how Marie had wakened them with urgent whispers, insisting they dress quickly in dark clothing and follow her to the cathedral, where Father Thibaudot would provide sanctuary until arrangements could be made for their permanent removal from their father's influence. They had barely reached the courtyard, rain soaking through their cloaks within seconds, and wind threatening to tear them from their feet, when Theodore appeared as if materialized from the storm itself, still dressed in the strange robes he wore during his descents into the well, garments that seemed to repel the rain, and that bore symbols that glowed with their own phosphorescence. What followed was a confrontation witnessed by several servants who later testified, though their accounts varied in details that suggested their minds had struggled to process what they saw, Theodore speaking in a voice not entirely his own, as if multiple entities spoke through his throat in harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce, Marie standing protectively before the children while clutching a crucifix that began to smoke and char in her grip, and Marguerite appearing like a specter in her nightgown, her feet not quite touching the ground as she glided across the rain-slicked stones, calling her children back with words that seemed to come from somewhere else, promises and threats mingling in languages that predated human speech. The storm's fury prevented neighbors from intervening, though several reported seeing Marie being dragged back into the house by forces they couldn't clearly identify, her screams cutting through the thunder before being abruptly silenced. The accumulation of mysterious disappearances connected to the Franklin property, combined with increasingly bold reports of supernatural phenomena that even the most skeptical citizens could no longer dismiss, finally prompted official attention from New Orleans authorities in late August 1832, though many would later question why intervention had taken so long given the mounting evidence. Sheriff Baptiste Reynard, a veteran lawman with 30 years of experience and a reputation for thoroughness that had solved cases others deemed hopeless, initiated a formal inquiry into the welfare of workers supposedly employed at the Franklin residence, beginning with what should have been routine questions about work permits and tax obligations. His investigation began with the bureaucratic approach that had served him well in the past, requesting documentation and conducting interviews with neighbors. but quickly evolved into something more serious as he uncovered patterns of missing persons that stretched back months and included dozens of men whose only common factor was answering Theodore Franklin's advertisements. Theodore Franklin received the sheriff with perfect composure that itself aroused suspicion, providing seemingly reasonable explanations for everything with a glibness that suggested rehearsal. Workers had completed their contracts and departed for other opportunities in booming territories to the west. The excavation was merely an expansion of their water collection system in preparation for future droughts that his study of weather patterns had predicted, and the unusual hours were necessitated by the extreme summer heat that made daytime work dangerous for men unaccustomed to the climate. He produced documentation that appeared to support his claims, signed receipts in multiple hands, completed contracts with terms clearly stated, and letters from workers expressing satisfaction with their employment and describing their plans for future endeavors, though Sheriff Reynard's trained eye noticed troubling discrepancies that suggested forgery on a massive scale. The signatures on various documents showed suspicious similarities when examined closely, as if one hand had attempted to disguise itself as many. The addresses provided for departed workers proved fictitious when investigated, leading to empty lots or businesses that had never heard of the supposed residents, and Theodore's explanations grew increasingly elaborate with each question, weaving complex narratives that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The investigation expanded dramatically when William Marchmont, editor of the New Orleans Commercial Bulletin and a man known for his pursuit of truth regardless of social pressure or personal danger, began his own parallel inquiry that would prove crucial in exposing the full scope of the horror. Marchmont had noticed the pattern of Franklin's advertisements appearing like clockwork, and the steady stream of solitary men entering but never leaving the Royal Street property, observations that his journalist's instincts told him concealed a story that the public needed to know. His newspaper began publishing carefully worded articles that skirted the edge of libel laws while raising questions about the whereabouts of specific missing persons, creating public pressure that even Theodore's wealth and social position couldn't entirely deflect or suppress through the usual channels of influence. William Marchmont's investigation into the Franklin property took a crucial and revealing turn when he gained access to the historic archives of the Cabildo through connections cultivated over years of investigative journalism. Searching through Spanish colonial records that few had examined since Louisiana became American territory, and that revealed truths deliberately hidden from public knowledge. What he discovered in those musty documents, written in fading ink by hands long turned to dust, sent chills through even his skeptical journalist's soul and provided the first real understanding of why Theodore Franklin had chosen this specific site for his excavation. Maps, dating from 1762, drawn with the meticulous care of Spanish military cartographers, clearly marked the location that would later hold the Franklin property, with warnings in Spanish, French, and a pictographic system that appeared to be indigenous, possibly a form of writing used by peoples who predated even the Native American tribes known to history. The Spanish text spoke of El Pozo Maldito, the cursed well or spring, while French notations warned of les eaux qui ne doivent pas être troublées, waters that must not be disturbed, suggesting that both colonial powers had encountered something at this site that transcended their usual territorial disputes. The indigenous symbols, when shown to elderly members of the Homa nation who still remembered the old ways, caused visible distress and reluctance to speak, with one elder refusing to discuss them beyond saying they marked places where the earth grows thin, where the boundaries between worlds became permeable under certain conditions. Further research through documents that had been misfiled or deliberately hidden revealed that the site had been systematically avoided during the original settlement of New Orleans, with the street grid curving unnaturally to accommodate this prohibition, creating the odd angles and irregular lots that characterized this section of the French Quarter. Only in 1794 had a French merchant named Guillaume Francois, Theodore's great-grandfather, whose portrait still hung in the Franklin home, successfully petitioned for permission to build on the site, arguing with Enlightenment fervor that Christian faith and modern reason could overcome primitive superstitions that held back progress and development. Marchmont discovered correspondence between Guillaume and associates in Lyon, Marseille, Prague, and other European cities known for their esoteric traditions, discussing their shared interest in sites of ancient significance scattered across the globe and their belief that certain locations held doors that await the proper keys, suggesting an organized effort to access knowledge or power that mainstream society had forgotten or suppressed. Theodore's family had not randomly chosen this property through the vagaries of the real estate market, but had sought it out specifically, traveling across an ocean and establishing themselves in a new society solely to claim it, a multi-generational obsession that spoke of purposes beyond mere commercial ambition. The journalist also uncovered references to similar excavations in the European cities mentioned in the correspondence, each associated with waves of disappearances that authorities blamed on plague or war, and eventual abandonment of the sites after incidents that official records described in vague terms that suggested deliberate obfuscation. The full horror of life within the Franklin household during the summer of 1832 was revealed through the remarkably detailed testimony of Claudette Beaulieu, a housemaid who fled to relatives in Baton Rouge after 6 months of employment that had transformed her from a cheerful young woman into someone who jumped at shadows and could no longer bear to be alone after dark. Her account, given to a parish priest who transcribed it for church records with a hand that trembled at certain passages, describes a domestic environment that had transformed from merely eccentric to genuinely terrifying as Theodore's work progressed and its influence spread throughout the household like a contagion. Claudette spoke of family rituals that became mandatory for all household members, performed at specific times corresponding to astronomical events that Theodore tracked with obsessive precision: new moons, planetary conjunctions, and dates that appeared in no Christian calendar but which he marked with red ink in charts that covered his study walls. These gatherings involved the entire household assembling in the courtyard around the well after midnight, where they would participate in ceremonies conducted by Theodore that grew more elaborate and disturbing with each iteration. The rituals involved chanting in unknown languages that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones, the burning of herbs and substances that produced nauseating smoke, which induced visions of vast underground spaces populated by things that had never known sunlight, and the lowering of objects wrapped in black cloth into the well's depths on chains that would emerge corroded and pitted as if exposed to centuries of decay in mere hours. She described with particular horror the delivery of unmarked crates during new moon nights, carried by men whose faces were always hidden, and who moved with an unnatural fluidity that suggested joints bent in ways human anatomy shouldn't permit. These crates, which Theodore would handle personally while wearing thick gloves that smoked and charred from contact, produced sounds of movement from within, despite containing no living things when eventually opened, revealing artifacts and instruments whose purposes defied understanding but which radiated a palpable sense of wrongness. Theodore's physical transformation alarmed her most viscerally. His skin had acquired a grayish pallor like that of a drowned man. His eyes rarely blinked, and when they did it was with a lateral motion more reptilian than human, and he had developed an aversion to running water that went beyond mere dislike, refusing to bathe and drinking only wine or spirits that he claimed had been properly prepared. Marguerite's condition was equally disturbing, though manifesting differently. She would enter catatonic states lasting hours, sitting motionless, while her lips formed silent words in languages that predated human speech, emerging with no memory of the lost time, but, speaking of, dreams in which she walked through vast, underground galleries filled with architecture that violated every principle of Euclidean geometry, and where she met things that wore the ditto shapes of her ancestors, but were hollow behind their faces. The children showed signs of similar deterioration that broke Claudette's heart to witness. Adelaide's musical talents had transformed into an ability to produce harmonies that seemed to contain multiple voices, including some that were definitively not human. Charles had begun holding lengthy conversations with unseen presences he claimed lived in the spaces between the walls and under the floors, and young Josephine would be found at all hours standing by the well in her nightgown, her eyes reflecting depths far greater than its physical measurements, and speaking to something far below, in a voice that carried undertones no child's throat should produce. By September 1832, the well beneath the Franklin property had reached a depth that challenged not only comprehension, but the very engineering principles that should have governed such an excavation. Over 300 feet of carefully reinforced shaft, descending through geological layers that, according to all surveys, should have been solid bedrock, yet yielded to Theodore's workers as if the earth itself conspired in the project. The workers who remained at this stage were exclusively those with no ability to communicate their experiences to the outside world, men whose languages were unknown in New Orleans and whose very presence in the city would leave no trace in official records. Yet even these hardened and desperate individuals showed signs of breaking under the strain of what they encountered in the depths, through gestures, drawings scratched in the dirt, and the universal language of terror. They reported that they had broken through into something that was definitively not a natural cave formation, a vast hollow space that extended beyond the reach of their torches and lanterns, with walls that met at angles that hurt to perceive and air that moved in patterns suggesting impossible geometries. This was not a cavern formed by water erosion or geological processes, but something that showed clear signs of artificial construction by intelligences that understood principles of engineering beyond human knowledge. Smooth walls that seemed to have been melted into shape rather than carved, meeting at angles that shouldn't have been able to exist in three-dimensional space. The channels cut into the floor that spiraled toward unknowable destinations following mathematical principles that made seasoned engineers weep with frustration when they tried to map them. Most disturbing to workers and Theodore alike was the presence of an ambient light that had no apparent source yet allowed visibility in the depths, a phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the very air and that revealed details better left unseen. Surfaces covered in bas-reliefs depicting ceremonies that predated human civilization, architectural features that suggested the space was designed for inhabitants of non-human proportions and capabilities, and worst of all, evidence that the space was not abandoned but merely dormant. Theodore's reaction to this discovery was recorded by his son Charles in a letter never sent but found hidden in his room among papers covered in disturbing sketches. Papa descended immediately upon hearing the news, lowering himself on chains that sang with tension, though he seemed to weigh nothing during the descent. He remained below for 7 hours while we waited in growing panic, Mother standing at the well's edge like a statue, while Adelaide wept, and Josephine laughed with a sound like breaking glass. When the workers finally hauled him up, responding to his tugs on the chain, he was changed. His hair had whitened at the temples, aging decades in hours. His hands shook with palsy that suggested exposure to forces human flesh wasn't meant to channel, yet his eyes burned with a fever of triumph that transformed his face into something I barely recognized as my father. He spoke only to say, "The threshold is near," before locking himself in his study, where he remained for 3 days without food or water, emerging only to order modifications to the well that defied comprehension. What followed was a frenzy of activity as Theodore ordered specific modifications to the well's mouth, installing a complex system of pulleys, counterweights, and platforms that incorporated both advanced engineering principles and elements that seemed more occult than mechanical, metal rods, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly, crystals that resonated with subsonic frequencies that made the house's foundations tremble, and mechanisms whose purposes even Theodore seemed uncertain of, but which he insisted were necessary for what was to come. The desperate circumstances within the Franklin household reached a crisis point when Adelaide, now 17 and fully aware of the horror engulfing her family, formulated a plan to escape and seek help from the authorities. Her journal, discovered hidden within the binding of a book of Psalms, details her growing realization that her father had crossed into realms of practice that endangered not only their lives, but their soul. She wrote of overhearing conversations between her parents in which they discussed the approaching conjunction and the fulfillment of the compact, with her mother weeping while her father spoke of sacrifices necessary for transcendence. Adelaide's investigation of the house revealed horrors she had never imagined. In a locked room adjacent to the well's access point, she discovered remains that were undeniably human, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual purpose rather than mere disposal. Some bones showed signs of gnawing by teeth that didn't match any known animal, while others had been carved with symbols that matched those in her father's forbidden books. Her journal entries become increasingly frantic as she describes her attempts to convince Charles to join her escape, only to find her brother had become a willing participant in their father's work. Speaking of the glorious transformation that awaited those who proved worthy, her final entry describes her plan to flee during the new moon when the household would be occupied with one of their ceremonies. She intended to reach Father Thibodeau at the cathedral, carrying with her evidence of her father's crimes, including pages torn from his own journals. The entry ends mid-sentence, and later investigation showed signs of struggle in her room. Adelaide was subsequently confined to the house's upper floor, with servants reporting hearing her prayers and weeping through the locked door. Her fate, like that of her mother and siblings, would remain unknown as the Franklin family's final descent into darkness approached its terrible culmination. Among the most damning documents recovered from the Franklin estate was Theodore's personal confession, apparently intended for his son Charles but never delivered, found sealed within a hidden compartment of his study desk. Written in a trembling hand that suggested great emotional distress, the confession reveals the full scope of the generational curse that had driven Theodore to his terrible actions. He wrote, "My son, if you read this, know that I have failed in my attempt to break the chains that bind our bloodline. What I believed was a path to transcendence has proven to be a snare that tightens with each generation." Theodore explained how his grandfather Guillaume had been part of an ancient society in Europe that sought to recover pre-Christian knowledge, specifically techniques for piercing the veils between worlds. Guillaume had discovered references to sites around the world where these veils were thinnest, places marked by ancient peoples who understood truths that modern civilization had forgotten. The New Orleans site was one such location, where indigenous peoples had once performed rituals to keep closed what should never be opened. Guillaume and his associates had believed they could control these forces, using them to gain knowledge and power beyond human limitations. The compact they made, written in blood and sealed with sacrifices, bound their descendants to complete the work they had begun. Theodore described how the knowledge had been passed to him upon his father's death, along with artifacts and books that revealed the true nature of their obligation. The well was not meant to reach water, but to breach the barriers between dimensions, creating a permanent opening through which those who wait beyond could enter our world. Theodore's confession reveals his growing realization that these entities were not the benevolent teachers his grandfather had believed them to be, but something far more alien and hostile to human life. Yet, the compact could not be broken, Each attempt to abandon the work resulted in torments that drove men mad, and the sins of previous generations demanded completion by their descendants. By late September 1832, Theodore Franklin announced to his household that the great work would soon be complete. The well had reached its final depth, preparations were in place, and the astronomical conditions would be optimal on the night of the autumn equinox. What followed was a series of increasingly bizarre events, documented by neighbors and authorities who maintained surveillance on the property. Strange processions began arriving at the Franklin house after dark, hooded figures who entered through the rear gate and descended immediately to the courtyard. These visitors spoke to no one, and their faces were never seen, but witnesses reported a wrongness about their movements, as if they were unused to walking on solid ground. The Franklin family ceased all public appearances. Even servants were dismissed, leaving only the nuclear family and their mysterious guests within the house. The well itself had undergone a transformation that defied explanation. The water that had always remained clear now appeared black as pitch, and several witnesses swore they saw it moving against gravity, creeping up the sides of the well shaft like a living thing. Most disturbing were the sounds that began emanating from the property, not the previous grinding of stone or chanting of voices, but something observers struggled to describe. A rhythmic pulsing like a massive heartbeat, punctuated by frequencies that induced nausea and vertigo in those who heard them. Animals throughout the neighborhood became agitated, with dogs howling incessantly and horses refusing to pass the property. The air itself seemed to thicken around the Franklin house, creating a miasma that made breathing difficult and caused metal objects to tarnish within hours. Theodore was glimpsed only once during this period, standing at an upper window, and witnesses reported that his appearance had changed dramatically. His proportions seemed wrong somehow, as if he were being stretched by invisible forces, and his movements had acquired an inhuman fluidity that disturbed all who saw it. The climactic intervention by authorities came on the 23rd of September 1832, when Sheriff Baptiste Reynard, bolstered by public pressure from William Marchmont's newspaper campaign and reports of increasingly disturbing phenomena, obtained a judicial warrant to search the Franklin property for evidence of criminal activity. The sheriff assembled a force of 12 men, including 2 priests who insisted on accompanying the expedition, and approached the Royal Street townhouse at midday when the strange effect seemed weakest. What they found would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. The house stood empty, its doors standing open and interior showing signs of hasty abandonment, overturned furniture, scattered papers, and personal belongings left behind as if the inhabitants had fled in terror. The true horror lay in the courtyard where the ancient well stood surrounded by complex mechanical constructions whose purpose defied understanding. The well's mouth had been widened and reinforced with metal bands covered in engraved symbols, while the black substance that had replaced the water now stood level with the rim, defying gravity and natural law. As the expedition approached, this substance began to recede, sinking back into the depths with a sound like massive lungs exhaling. The adjoining chambers revealed evidence of multiple deaths, human remains in various states of decomposition, ritual implements stained with substances the investigators couldn't identify, and most disturbing, a series of preserved specimens in glass jars that appeared to be failed attempts at creating hybrid beings combining human and utterly alien anatomies. Sheriff Reynard ordered an immediate withdrawal when one of his men, peering into the well, began screaming about shapes moving in the depths and had to be physically restrained from throwing himself into the shaft. The priests performed an emergency blessing of the site, though both reported feeling an active resistance to their prayers, as if something powerful and malevolent opposed their presence. The systematic investigation of the Franklin house following the initial shocking discoveries revealed a network of horror extending far beyond what Sheriff Reynard's expedition had first encountered. In Theodore's study, investigators found extensive correspondence with individuals in Prague, Lyon, Venice, and Edinburgh, all discussing similar excavation projects and sharing progress reports on their attempts to achieve the breakthrough. Adelaide Franklin's complete diary was discovered hidden in her room, providing crucial documentation of the family's descent into madness and revealing that she had been forcibly subjected to rituals intended to prepare her for transformation. The diary's final entries, written in an increasingly erratic hand, described visions of vast cities beneath the earth populated by beings that had never known sunlight, and her growing certainty that her father intended to offer his entire family as payment for whatever knowledge or power he sought. Charles's room contained hundreds of drawings, showing the progression of his obsession, early sketches of the well giving way to complex diagrams of non-Euclidean geometries, and finally to portraits of entities whose very appearance on paper seemed to cause viewing distress. Josephine's nursery was perhaps most disturbing, with toys arranged in ritual patterns and the walls covered in writing in her childish hand, but in languages no child should know. Theodore's own papers revealed the full scope of his preparations. Detailed astronomical calculations, lists of necessary sacrifices, and most chilling, a contract written in multiple languages, including some that appeared to predate human civilization, signed by Theodore and bearing other signatures that seemed to write on the page. The investigators also catalogued the mechanical devices surrounding the well, determining that they were designed not just to facilitate descent, but to maintain an opening once established. Theodore had been attempting to create a permanent portal, held open by machinery, that incorporated both advanced engineering and principles that violated known physics. The authorities' response to the discoveries at the Franklin house was swift and decisive, driven by a combination of public safety concerns and barely suppressed terror at what had been uncovered. The immediate decision was made to seal the well permanently, using a combination of concrete, iron bars, and religious artifacts blessed by multiple denominations. The sealing process itself was fraught with difficulties. The first attempt to pour concrete into the well resulted in the mixture being expelled violently, injuring several workers. Strange phenomena continued throughout the operation. Tools would rust within minutes of approaching the well. Workers reported hearing voices calling their names from the depths, and several men had to be restrained from attempting to descend into the shaft. The successful sealing was finally achieved only after Father Thibaudot performed an extended exorcism of the site, though he later confided that he felt he had only suppressed rather than banished whatever forces were at play. The upper structures of the Franklin property were demolished on the orders of the city council, officially due to structural instability, but actually from fear that the buildings themselves had been contaminated by the activities within. All artifacts and documents were supposed to be destroyed, but various items found their way into private collections and archives, ensuring that knowledge of the events would persist despite official efforts at suppression. The human remains, discovered on the property, were interred in consecrated ground after extensive religious ceremonies, though cemetery records note ongoing disturbances around these graves for years afterward. The city records were officially sealed, with access restricted to senior officials and clergy, while public announcements characterized the entire affair as a case of murder and madness brought on by Theodore Franklin's occult obsessions. The property itself was left vacant, with the sealed well hidden beneath tons of earth and rubble, though the city quietly purchased all surrounding properties to prevent development in the area. In the aftermath of the Franklin house discoveries, the fate of the family remained New Orleans' most troubling mystery. Despite extensive searches and investigations across multiple states and territories, no trace of Theodore, Marguerite, Adelaide, Charles, or young Josephine was ever definitively found. The authorities' working theory that they had fled the city and assumed new identities was complicated by numerous reported sightings over the following years that defied easy explanation. In 1834, a traveling merchant claimed to have encountered a family matching the Franklins' description in rural Mississippi, though he noted they seemed to avoid daylight and spoke in whispers that carried impossible distances. A priest in Mobile reported being approached by a young woman calling herself Adelaide, who wished to confess to impossible sins, but she fled when he attempted to bring her into the church. Most disturbing were reports from ship's captains of a family seen on the docks at various Gulf ports, always at night, always seeking passage to Caribbean islands known for their isolation. The Franklin property itself refused to remain quietly buried. Despite the tons of fill, dirt, and construction debris used to cover the site, depressions would regularly appear in the ground above where the well had stood. Plants refused to grow in a perfect circle, marking the well's location, and animals avoided the area entirely. In 1847, an attempt to build new structures on the site had to be abandoned when workers reported tools disappearing, unexplained accidents, and the sound of rushing water beneath the foundations, despite the well supposedly being sealed solid. A series of mediums and spiritualists who visited the site in the 1,850 seconds all reported similar visions of vast underground spaces, still accessible through the sealed portal, and entities waiting patiently for another opportunity to complete what Theodore Franklin had begun. Modern archaeological interest in the site has been repeatedly blocked by city authorities citing safety concerns, though urban explorers claim to have documented temperature anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, and acoustic phenomena centered on the well's location. Construction workers in the area still report finding artifacts that shouldn't exist, stones with impossible carvings, metal implements of unknown purpose, and occasionally pieces of the mechanical devices Theodore had constructed, still showing signs of function despite decades of burial.